Okay, I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis very quickly, and this will be a lesson for today because this is going to come out in the essays. So, just a bit background information. Cuba is important to the US. First, you need to look at the political interest because Cuba, as you know in this map here, is very close to the US. As you can see, Cuba is right here. So there is strategic importance of this little island state to the US, which is over here, and Mexico is here right below the US. So first thing is a gateway to the Caribbean islands. So where exactly are the Caribbean islands? Is the Bahamas and these islands over here. Okay. The protection of these islands is dependent upon Cuba because if you can build a base in Cuba, a military base, then the US is going to be under threat. That is for certain. So one of the important things of Cuba towards the US is the security of the US. Okay, the US needs Cuba to be on its side in order that the security of the country can be protected simply because of the close proximity that they are. Okay, so the US actually came up with this document called the Monroe Doctrine. They actually said that the whole of the Americas, including North America and South America, was under the sphere of influence of the US. So any attempts at European or Soviet intervention or colonialism of this area would be seen as a threat, a direct threat to the US. Okay, that is the whole point of this Monroe Doctrine. Of course, US at the time were not that strong in the past, so many Europeans violated this doctrine, but nonetheless it's still there to show that the US had a very strategic interest in Cuba, in Mexico, in the South American states. Okay, so what did the US do in order to protect its interests? Well, it sent a lot of forces, secret forces there to install puppet governments. They actually overthrew the first Cuban government first and installed puppet governments to rule Cuba so that their interests can be protected and that they are friendly to the US. Okay, why would they do this? Because Cuba is a great source of sugar. The main things that they export out are sugar and tobacco. So what better way to get sugar and tobacco than to have your own friendly puppet government inside the state itself? So that is what the US did, and that is how they can protect their economic interests such that they can sell sugar and tobacco back to the US for a cheap price. Not only that, but lots of American investment was in Cuba. Many of the plants, the factories, the sugar plantations were all owned by Americans, all Cuban, friendly Cuban relations with America. Okay, so the economic interest is one of the key points why Cuba was important to the US at that point in time. So it's the political and the economic. Okay, next thing. So of course Cuba is going to retaliate because they think that American domination is a form of imperialism, is a form of colonialism. They do not want to be ruled by a foreign entity like America. So because they were upset over American dominance, especially in the area of the industries, in the sugar plantations and so on and so forth. Because when you have a certain select few Cuban people supporting Americans, that is when they can make a lot of money. So when you have a select few making a lot of money because of their strong allegiance to the US, you have the oppression of the poor. Okay, because how do these big industries make money of the sugar plantations or the tobacco? Is by exploiting the poor. So that is when people became upset. Why do we not own our farm? Why do we not have opportunities for growth? Why is everything being exploited by the US and only this select few are earning the money that we need? So therefore, people were upset over American domination. It is just exactly like in Southeast Asia. Why are the Europeans dominating Southeast Asia and exploiting us, the local people, okay, for money? That is why they're angry. They want to have a revolution. Okay, second thing was that the US actually supported this guy called Batista, and you could say that he was a dictator. He was someone who was very firm, who was very strict, and was very oppressive, especially to the local people. Okay, just like Stalin, just like Hitler, but a little bit lesser. but the US continued to support this guy because he was a pro-US guy. So they were having a dilemma. Should they continue to support Batista or should they give up? That is the thing. But because Batista is a pro-US guy and because he can help to pressure all other non-US related political parties out of Cuba, that's why they continue to support Mr. Batista. Of course, in the end, people are unhappy because he's an oppressive leader, and there was a revolution that sparked off, led by none other than Castro himself. So Castro is going to be a main character that you must know in this whole missile crisis issue thing. Okay, initially he was a revolutionist, he was a nationalist, he just wanted America to get out of Cuba so that Cuba can have their own freedom, their own independence, their own political system, and there will be no exploitation of sugar, of tobacco for America. We don't need to depend on the price of sugar, the exploitation of sugar by America. So that's why this guy came out. But of course, during that time, there were also communist parties in Cuba, and they aligned their support together with Castro. Of course, during that time, this was the start of the Cold War, so there were two blocks of power. So Castro, being anti-American, in order to get allies, the best way to do it is to align himself with the other sphere of influence, which is the Soviet Union and the Soviet Party. So that is exactly what he did. Okay, so let's look at some of the acts of Castro that led to declining relations with the US. First, economic policies. What did this man do? He opened up new markets for Cuban sugar because he was upset. He didn't want America, of course, to dominate the sugar industry. So he went off and got help from the USSR. He signed deals to sell sugar to the USSR in return for Soviet oil. Okay, this way US could not control the price of sugar because previously US had a monopoly. That means that they were the only one dealing with the Cubans in the regards to sugar, so they can control the price, right? Because they need to sell to America, and all the companies and industries are largely owned by Americans, so they had control of the price. So Mr. Castro decided to stop. This has to end. So he started dealing with the USSR so that we have, if America decides to lower their price, then oh, so be it. We'll just deal with the USSR instead. So then we have it, barter trade with the Soviet oil. The second thing he did was land reforms. As you know, he was going closer and closer to communism. And communism is a system whereby there is state ownership, there is nationalization of businesses, of industries. So what did he do? He restricted foreign ownership of companies. He redistributed the farmland because these were the promises he made to gain support in his revolution. So that is what he did, redistributing the farmland, getting the seizure of industries. Of course, he gave financial compensations to make it seem a little bit like he's not really that bad guy, but he just want to keep his promise to the Cuban people, the promise that he made to the people during the Cuban Revolution. Okay, so of course, other things that he did, political impact, his friendship with Khrushchev. Khrushchev at the time was the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. So there was a situation whereby the UN actually had a General Assembly in the US, and what this guy did, what Castro did, was instead of staying in the normal hotel meant for foreign leaders who came, he actually went to stay in a quite low class hotel called the Harlem Hotel, and this was located in a district where there were many African Americans, and at that point in time in America, African Americans were oppressed by the whites, okay, by the naturally US people. So the reason why he went there was so he could speak to these African Americans, so that he can raise the issue of discrimination, and of course to put the US in a bad light. So what Khrushchev did was that Khrushchev was also invited to this assembly, went ahead to visit Castro in the Harlem Hotel, and it's there where they both demonstrated against African American discriminatory practices. Of course, this led to a lot of tensions with the US because why are you ruining the US reputation by aligning with this guy? So it made the US think that, hey, actually this guy is moving further and further away from us. He's moving towards the communist cause. He's aligning himself more and more with the communist bloc. So we had to do something to stop him. So we had to ensure that our security concerns can be kept. Just like in the beginning where I told you, we need our security concerns, because if they build a base in Cuba, they are just at our doorstep. Okay, so the alignment with Khrushchev was one of the final steps which led to irreparable relationships with the US. Okay, so what did the US do? The US, of course, didn't like the government run by Mr. Castro himself. So what the US did first was economic pressure to weaken Castro's government and eventually overthrow the government back to the puppet government with some of the US friendly leaders. Okay. So what did Castro do in retaliation for this economic pressure? Basically, US did a few things, one of which was it got these oil companies in Cuba to not deal with the money received from Cuba, not deal with the oil, not to refine the oil that Cuba received in exchange for sugar with the Soviet Union. So what did Cuba do in return? They nationalized the oil refineries. That means they took all the oil refineries out of the hands of the private industries to the state. So the state will own all these things. The state will also own the banks, the railways and ports. And some of these were already owned by the US, so it was forcefully taken from the US companies to the state. So of course the US is going to be very upset about this. But the reason why this happened is because tensions were already at an all-time high. It was a peak high tension. Okay, so then they also declared the Declaration of Havana, which means that Castro himself made a declaration that indeed the US were exploiting Cuba, were exploiting the sugar, the tobacco industries. He said it to the media, he said it to the world, he declared it at Havana, and this of course strained relations to the extreme. What did the US do in return? They embargoed, because they still controlled certain aspects of Cuba's economy. They had a trade embargo of all things except food and medicine. Why food and medicine? Because they are trying to send a message to the world that they are not there to harm the Cuban people, but they are doing this because they want to get rid of Castro, because they believe he is someone who is harming US interests, who is harming them, and who is aligned with the communist bloc, something that they do not want Cuba to fall into the hands of. So that's why they did. Of course, this strained relations, this made things worse for both Cuba and the US. Okay, and the final straw came when President Kennedy decided to have a Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow Castro's government. Okay, basically he got a few CIA trained exiles to invade this part of Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs. Okay, of course, as you know, it was a military disaster. Mr. Castro himself, he was already ready for the invasion. So the moment the US went in, within 2 days they were defeated. It was known as a military disaster, a diplomatic fiasco. But nonetheless, this strained relations, because now Cuba and Castro knows that the US are not on friendly terms and they're willing to take extreme measures to want to actually overthrow his government. So Castro needs to find a way out of this situation to ensure that the US cannot bully them into submission. Okay, so after the failure of this Bay of Pigs, Kennedy went ahead to do Operation Mongoose, another CIA operation to sabotage, overthrow the government through sabotaging the Cuban economy. Okay, some things that they did was planning to bomb the sugar plantations and assassinate the key leaders in Cuba's government. But of course, this was not successful again. So then it proved a signal, it proved a signal to Mr. Castro that the US was trying to be funny, the US was trying to do things that are against the sovereignty of Cuba. So what did they do? Of course, they went ahead and had an alliance with the USSR. So Bay of Pigs led to search for allies. We need security. We need to strengthen our own security. We need to strengthen our own military. Okay, the presence of US military exercises in the Caribbean also stroked fears. The US were at the border of Cuba and they were practicing their military. They were intending to bomb some unnamed base, which of course they managed to research, and it probably would mean that they are planning to bomb Cuba itself. So under alert, the whole Cuba was under alert, so Castro needed to find a way out of this situation. And the best way, because he's already friends with Mr. Khrushchev, was to declare himself officially as aligned with the communist bloc of nations. So that is when Cuba started being involved in the Cold War. A nation that is so near to the US, one of the first few nations near to the US that fell to communism, and that became a part of the Cold War rivalry. And this was the impetus that started to strain relations, and in the end, of course, you know, in the following chapters you will know that the US started to be wary of Cuba, and Cuba started to agree to let Soviet help them to build the nuclear missiles in Cuba. And this of course was a direct threat to the US, and the world was put on high alert because of this, and this was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis.